Good afternoon, growers. Morgan here from 3,000 Acres, and this afternoon we're speaking about how to grow successfully in pots, specifically around veggies and fruit. Now, for a very long time, I was a rental gardener. I lived for years in rental properties and wanted to be growing a great deal of things there. So where I wasn't able to grow in the ground, I found that pots were an absolute godsend because I was able to move things from different rental properties. Even now, living in a house where I'm going to be permanently, I still do some growing in pots because there are even some veggies and fruit that I find go better in that scenario. So for a lot of you tuning in, you might be renters, you might have a small space, and I'm here to tell you that absolutely growing in pots is an option for you, can be entirely successful, and I'd really love to address any questions you have about doing that. I'd love to hear about some successes and failures you've had growing in pots. If there's a particular thing and you want to know if you can grow it in a pot, please post it in the comments below and I'll address those questions as we go. So this video is part of #Darebin Backyard Harvest. I'm a Darebin resident, have been for a long time, and we're celebrating all of the things that are backyard growing, sharing, cooking all across Darebin. So please do share any stories you have from across Darebin about growing in your backyard. So the first thing that happens when people want to learn about growing in pots is the question of what can I grow in a pot? What can I be successful with? And there's a few caveats I have on this because there's a lot of things you can grow in a pot successfully, but the main things that limit it are the size of the pot, how much space you have for it to grow, in particular how deep it is in terms of the root zone of the plant being able to grow successfully. How successful you are with your watering, so how consistent you are in terms of providing water for that plant, ensuring that it's got everything that it needs. The quality of your potting mix, which has less to do with whether or not a plant will be, which plants will be successful, and more to do with whether or not it will work in general. I find the biggest thing that goes wrong when people grow in pots is they think they can chuck any old soil inside. That's not the case. You do need to make sure that it's really nutrient dense when you grow in a pot, because unlike growing in the ground, the nutrients are constantly running out the bottom of that pot, so it's more difficult for the plant to get everything it needs in order to grow successfully. When I talk about watering for the pot, what I'm talking about there is how often you're watering and whether or not it's a self-watering pot. That is a pot that basically acts like a wicking bed, where there might be a little reservoir of water for the plant to suck up. That affects what sort of plants you can grow in it. But for example, if you're someone who doesn't do a lot of watering, if you don't have a self-watering plant, there are still options available to you, such as Mediterranean crops. We'll talk about that a little bit later. On top of that, in terms of what you can grow in a pot, a big thing to keep in mind is that some plants are more tolerant of that environment than others. That can have to do with the size of the plant or what you're trying to grow on it. So for example, there are some veggies we eat that have a really deep root system and they're going to struggle to make it work in a small pot. So all of that said, let me help you choose your pot. The first thing you need to think about is what material your pot is made out of. You can see behind me here, I have kind of a faux terracotta pot that I'm utilizing. So it's just made of plastic, and that's something that's worked really well for me because while terracotta pots look absolutely beautiful, they also heat up and they're super porous, so the water comes out of them. If you're big into terracotta pots, go for it. A glaze on it is going to reduce the amount of water that gets leached out of the pot, but on top of that, you can also line the inside to reduce some of that water loss and some of the heat effect on the plant. If you're really committed to the terracottas and you don't want to line them, that's fine. It just limits the sort of plants that are going to be successful in there. So for example, you might want to look more at the Mediterranean crops. Think pomegranates, think olives, think rosemary. Those can really enjoy life inside of a terracotta pot. And what's more, it just means that you have to keep the water up to them. That means being really consistent with all of your watering. On top of that, the other thing that you want to think about with choosing your pot is how big it is. That is, how deep is it in terms of the root zone of the plant, keeping in mind that like for a lot of veggies, they're going to want at least 20 centimeters at a bare minimum for them to get their roots deep enough to hold themselves in place. So let's turn around and take a look at some of these pots that I have. So here you can see a pretty average size pot that I've got what is known as a macret lime. Some people know them as a kaffir lime, although we're trying to get away from that name. And this one here is, as you can see, a plastic. If I tap on it, you can kind of see that. So it looks a lot like terracotta, but it's actually a faux plastic, which I pulled out of hard rubbish. These work really well for me, I find, because you don't have as much evaporation. Now, Tracy's asked a great question. What do you line terracotta pots with? Well, Tracy, the thing I've used in the past when I'm trying to be fancy is actually just putting one of these plastic pots inside the terracotta. And often that's the pot that a larger veggie or fruit tree came in, and then that's able to fit inside the terracotta pot. But I've seen a number of solutions done. Some people use styrofoam, which is a questionable material for the garden in terms of it breaking down. I find that rats get into it, and if you have chooks, they'll peck at it. But it is one more thing that can reduce some of that loss. So Tracy says she would just try to avoid using plastic. I totally get that. I'm not talking about going out and buying any more plastic. I'm talking about stuff that you can pull out of hard rubbish or comes with the plant when you buy it. But if you're opposed to using plastic in the garden for health reasons or just in general, I totally understand that as well. It's just a limitation with terracotta pots in terms of their water loss, but they can absolutely be successful. Now, something else I wanted to note was about the opportunity to have a self-watering pot. Say you're a person who's always forgetting to water your pots, or you have some plants that are a little bit more water hungry. This is a great example of where it can work. So you can see that little drain inside of there, and this is some strawberries that are potted up and desperately in need of a prune back. For this one, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to keep the water up to my strawberries. They quite like having really good access to water. So all you're doing is watering on the top level, and there's a reservoir down the bottom that is holding that water inside the system for the roots to wick up when they want. These pots are available at lots of nursery and garden centers. I often find them in hard rubbish, but also know people who make them themselves quite successfully. These can be great, say if you have a really hot balcony, your plants all get a little bit too sun-drenched, you're not home to give them some water, this can be the solution. I find these pots work really well for strawberries growing at home. You can even see there's some late season strawberries just there. That one's even getting a little bit of color. But these also work really well for some of the herbs. So at this time of year, you could start a self-watering pot with, for example, some parsley, some coriander. They would be very successful. Thyme, oregano would also be quite happy in this. So that's a great solution as well. Something to keep in mind with either pot that you go for is one of the things that always gets missed when people are growing in pots, and that's the need for high quality potting mix. As I mentioned before, because this has a drain in the bottom of it, as soon as you're putting any nutrients on the top, say for example, any fertilizers, anything that's in the soil that the plant wants to make use of, when you water, all of those nutrients are running out the bottom of the pot and are no longer accessible to the plant. That's a problem for its long-term growing success. So when they produce high-quality potting mix, for example, in the store, what they're doing is putting a lot of slow-release fertilizers in there. They're making sure that the potting mix has really good structure so that it holds on to those nutrients for a longer period of time and allows for the plant to uptake the nutrients over even perhaps a year, 2 years. That said, if you want to make your own potting mix, that is absolutely fine. I just recommend that you don't go straight to your compost and you don't just grab soil out of the ground or use a bag that is generalized soil mix. I would try and make a specialized potting mix so that you can make sure that your plant will be successful. That might include putting some slow release fertilizer in there. There's 1,000,001 recipes on the internet, and I wouldn't want to put my money on any one of them. Keep in mind as well that if you're growing a perennial, that is a plant that grows over many seasons, like this fruit tree here, you will need to repot periodically. So say every 2 years, I would pull this tree out, give its roots a little trim, refresh the soil with fresh potting mix and slow release fertilizer, and put it back in. It's not too time intensive to do that every 2 years. And with a little dwarf citrus like this, no problem at all. It's a task I can do on my own or with one other person. So let me flip back around. So all of that said, you might be wondering, so what should I plant? I'm really excited. I've got some pots ready to go. What should I put in them? I have my top recommendations here for you. The first thing that I recommend for pots, regardless if it's self-watering or just a standard pot, is herbs. Herbs are very easy to grow in pots, and it's something you can be self-sufficient in from home. To stop buying those little $5 containers from the grocery store of herbs, the joy. It is a great feeling. So that would be my first go-to. But another recommendation I have, and this is one that I'm continuing to grow in pots even as a homeowner, is blueberries. Blueberries love good drainage. They don't like getting wet feet. So being able to have a pot where it free drains out the bottom is something blueberries are well into. They're also quite size appropriate for a pot. So some of the smaller varieties that only get to 1.5 meters over many years, perfect for a pot. Strawberries as well, I find are very compact and appropriate for a pot as well. The last one on there is when people are interested in having a tree. So for example, if you want to have some fun with your pruning, or you want to just have a little bit of fruit in your backyard, even though you're growing in pots, I highly recommend that you try out anything that's Mediterranean. So again, think olives, think pomegranates. Very happy in pots. The same goes for citrus. Citrus, like blueberries, doesn't like to have wet feet, so it can be a great solution for a pot as well. My last suggestion is stuff that I don't want you to try out until about October. That's when we're going back into spring, summer, and you can grow those hot season crops. At that point, something I recommend for pots is chilies, capsicums, and eggplants. All of those are quite compact and can grow in a medium-sized pot quite happily. But if all that sounds overwhelming, go back to the first one on my list, herbs. Herbs are very easy in pots and are a great place to start for some success. I recommend you get started at this time of year with parsley, coriander, oregano, thyme, rosemary. Beautiful solutions. Coriander in particular is one of the tougher crops to grow, but grows really well across autumn and winter here in Melbourne. So I recommend giving that one a go. So I hope this has been interesting in terms of what's possible in terms of growing in pots. Feel free to add any questions you have below, and I'll come back and be answering those throughout the week. And share any of your gardening adventures with us using hashtag Darebin Backyard Harvest. We're actually going to be choosing a winner in a few weeks' time of the best photograph, video, recipe, story, whatever else, to win a copy of Retro Suburbia. So check out for that competition too. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you soon.